The following program has been pre-recorded, so please don't call in at this time. If you wish to participate in the program, tune in at 5 p.m. every Wednesday for A Pause for Thought on Baton Rouge Community Radio. Good evening, fellow humans. This is Wayne Parker with A Pause for Thought here on Baton Rouge Community Radio, 96.9 FM in Baton Rouge. It's good to be here tonight. How about you, Lang? Oh, yeah.
Doing great.
Yeah, good. Yeah, don't feature
Glad to be
microphone,
here.
buddy. Yeah. Yes, this is a live call-in program, 343-9927, 343-9927. If you'd like to call in and chat with Lang and me tonight, or should I say Lang and myself? Never mind. That's a pet peeve of mine, but for people who don't understand that particular part of grammar, I'm certainly not an expert, but I know that one. Anyway.
Good.
Anyway, our topic for tonight is going to be the history of Yemen, and really the civil war that's going on there now, and I guess you could call it a proxy war too, you know, based on what we're finding and what little we've been told from our mainstream media. But if you'd like to call in and share your thoughts, comments, and questions or challenges, 343-9927, 343-9927. And I suppose another subtitle for our topic tonight would be how to create more terrorists against the West. But anywho, all right, Yemen. It's located somewhere in the northern part of Africa, right?
It's a southern part of the Arabian Peninsula.
Saudi Arabian Peninsula, yeah.
South of Saudi Arabia.
Okay,
it's the south end of the Red Sea, across from Eritrea.
Right, and the being where it is one of the reasons why it was such a rich country historically, right?
Yeah, it was at a prime location on the trade routes between Eastern and Western civilizations way back when. But they say that there were significant settlements there of like 5,000 years BC.
BC or
yeah,
BC, right?
Yeah.
That's earlier time, yeah.
And they've got a long history of interaction with the various larger powers that surrounded them through the centuries.
And they were a very fertile region too originally. In fact, I have here an article from Time magazine that talks about them. Yemen means South Arabia in Arabic, but the Romans referred to the area as Arabia Felix, and this article says that means happy Arabia, but you said it's probably more like...
Well, I saw another article that gave both that translation and also the translation of fertile Arabia. It is contrasted to the desert areas of Arabia,
and that was
meaning the Arabian Peninsula. And
right, but the other name for it was, or for that region was the Arabia Desert or something like that.
Yes, for the drier parts.
Right, and so that tells me it's more than likely the Arabia Felix meant fertile. But
yeah, and for about 1,000 years or so, this was the kingdom of Sheba, or the realm of Sheba, which
he was
famous for its spices and woods, and there were gifts brought by the Queen of Sheba to King Solomon in the Bible story, and also in the Ethiopian tradition, and the Quran as well talks about that.
Yeah. Okay, and the kings of Saba, which was the biblical Sheba, it says here in this article that in 700 BC, the Marib Dam was built, and that was what enabled the people to irrigate their farmland and become so prosperous with agriculture. And they were also, here it says here, in the 1st century CE, a Roman mariner talked about the frankincense country, which was Yemen. I guess he called it that. But yeah, they were a pivotal crossroads for trade and travel for quite a bit of time. And a neat fact here, though, in this article it states that on his way to India, the Apostle Thomas is said to have stopped at the Yemeni island of Socotra, I guess, some 200 miles south of the country's mainland. And that reminded me of how there are a lot of scholars of the Middle East who believe that Jesus had traveled to India based upon the fact that there are some rituals still performed there that celebrate a foreigner coming in from his part of the world. So it makes sense to me that, you know, if that's true, the Apostle Thomas may have tried to follow in his footsteps, heading out to proselytize or convert the world, you know. But anyway, but yeah, they were quite rich, but I guess by implication here, by the fact that the Romans were involved with them, they, like every other country in that area in that region, experienced some foreign occupation, didn't they?
Yeah, well, from what I read, the first efforts by the Romans were unsuccessful. The large Roman army was defeated, and there was only 10,000 men, according to this source. It took 6 months to get there and 60 days to return to Egypt after their defeat. But then later, the Romans were successful in their efforts to enter the area around 350 A.D. By this time we're talking about the Eastern Roman Empire, or the Byzantium
Right.
Empire that came into the area to convert the locals to Christianity, which were resisted by the local Jews at that time. So we've got religious conflict from an early time here in this part of the world.
Well, we have religious conflict pretty much since the beginning of humanity, if you think about it. But I guess it took a while for different religions to be created or to form. So anyhow, I did want to call attention, though. You mentioned you used the term A.D., which is for Anno Domini, Year of Our Lord, I think is what it is.
Yeah, it's a Latin.
And I use the term CE for Common Era, and BCE is before the Common Era. And it kind of makes it more religiously neutral, which I think is probably appropriate. But, you know, because there are other religions in the world besides Christianity, you know.
That's right.
Anyhow, just thought I'd clear that up and show off a little bit. Not that anybody's really impressed with me, but
And then there are other ways of counting the years as well.
yeah, other calendars, but anyway, okay. So we had the Romans, and then you were saying how, well, Islam, I guess, moved in around the 6th century, right? That was when they became big across.
That would have come later in
Okay, so right now we've got Jews and then Christians battling it out in the region, right?
Yes, you had battles in the like 521. There was a Jewish warlord that rose to power in that area of the world after over the fall of the previous ruler, and he embarked on a campaign to take a revenge for the destruction of synagogues that had occurred during the previous period by attacks on the Christians in the community, and then the Byzantines and other Christian areas of the world, the Christian Arabs from the Aksum Empire, which was on Africa across the Red Sea from Yemen, came and reasserted the Christian powers against this Jewish warlord that had risen up, and so you've got that strong battle going on. And then, a century or so later, Muhammad came along and Islam entered the scene, and then you had another factor in there, waging war.
And then at some point, I guess, to get us up to fairly close to modern times, the Ottoman Empire extended its control down through Yemen, did they not?
Jump forward about 1,000 years, and you got the Ottomans coming into the area.
Okay, but was Britain there before? I mean, Britain was trading through there or traveling through there, trading. Were they there before the Ottomans?
No, not the first time the Ottomans came. According to what I was reading, they arrived in the mid 1500s to assert rule in the area.
Okay. Because we know from previous shows we've done on other countries in the Middle East that the trade routes there brought all the Europeans through that part of the world quite a bit, and the British were one of the countries that stayed and established a lot of beachheads there, and ended up taking control and losing control and things like that over the centuries?
Yeah, the British, pretty much from what I was reading, is in the 1800s when they came
Okay.
along. As we talked on one of the earlier programs about their interest in the Suez Canal for their trade routes to between Europe and their crown jewel of their empire, India, and Yemen figures into that scheme as well, where they established a port, or established a beachhead at the port of Aden in Yemen for as a coal depot for their steamships, because it took such a large amount of coal to power their ships from the Suez to Bombay and back, 700 tons of coal for a round trip. And so they came in and forced their acceptance to establish the protectorate in Aden, which was the port in Yemen on the southern coast there.
Right. And the two main cities that I've seen were Sana'a and then the port of Aden. The Sana'a, I guess, is the capital of Yemen, and then Aden is the major port. But, okay, well, all right, so we've had the Ottomans in there, and I guess after World War I, the Ottoman Empire collapsed, and so the British began to assert control, but they couldn't take control of the whole country, could they? I mean, at that time, that was when it was divided into two different countries, I believe?
Well, there was a kingdom in there were two different countries, North Yemen and South Yemen, and there was a kingdom established at the end of the First World War from 1918 to in the 1960s sometime, which was ruled as a kingdom, and then the British maintained rule in what became South Yemen, but it was British control up until around 1967, I believe, when the British left or turned over to self-rule for South Yemen, the country of South Yemen. And North Yemen arose in a rebellion against the kingdom when there were a couple of factors from what I was reading. One was the king was trying to have his son be the ruler to succeed him, and he resisted modernization, and then there were the local faction of generals, I believe, that rose up against him, and they wanted modernization.
Okay, yeah, you kind of confused me there, but the British had the South, the North had a kingdom, and of course the British no doubt had an interest in modernizing things, but the king in the North didn't want anything to do with that. And so they rebelled against him, I guess.
Yeah, well, I think the modernization movement was a hangover from when the Ottomans had it before the First World War, and there was resistance by the conservatives in the society against this modernization movement that the Ottoman Empire was implementing from, I think, the late 1930s, or 1830s, excuse me, up through next few decades. And so this was a continuation of that conflict between to modernize or not.
Okay.
And so they established the Republic of Yemen, which was North Yemen, in the 1960s. The Civil War, I think, went on from around 62 to 68, something like that. And in the meantime, there was an uprising against the British in the Protectorate of Aden in South Arabia that were under British control. It became in South Yemen. So you had these two countries in the 1960s come into existence, North Yemen and South Yemen.
And that was a result of the Arabian or Yemeni or whatever, I guess it was Arabians, controlled the northern part of Yemen, and the British were holding on to their protectorate in the south because of the port. And for various reasons, both of them were disrupted and overthrown, and then it became one country, I guess, in 1990.
Yeah, so
right?
From what I was reading, you essentially had two civil wars that resulted in the creation of these two countries, and then these two countries went to war against each other for a while, and then they united and formed one country, and then they had a civil war within that one country, and then they resolved that conflict and became Yemen of today.
Yes,
Although
okay.
Now we've got war going on among factions there, so there's still
the same thing's going on, yeah, forever. But again, I wanted to throw in two here. It says here in this one article that a faction of radical Marxists took over in 1970 in South Yemen and became the People's Democratic Republic of Yemen, and was propped up by communist backers. And of course, that didn't last long either. And then the two Yemens eventually formed the thing in 1990. But that was one more factor in there. Was of course communism, which we know from talking about the other countries. After the Ottoman Empire collapsed at the end of World War I, Russia became a major player, and certainly after World War II, Russia got involved, and they were competing just as strenuously for control of the Middle East as the British and the French were back then, and then later us, of course. And so yeah, it's just been a crazy mess, I guess, of warring factions, and really they reduced themselves, from what I've read anyway. I don't mean to speak like an expert, but they reduced themselves from this fertile, wealthy country to abject poverty, which eventually brought, invited or allowed Al Qaeda to come in as the savior of everybody and establish a beachhead there. And they're actually, I think Al Qaeda, they call them here ACAP, AQAP, but Al Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula,
Right.
and that's one of the strongest or most powerful factions of Al Qaeda, I believe, in the world, precisely because the area was so fertile for another reason, fertile for terror, their kind of ideology and everything else. Starving people tend to clutch to whatever claims it's going to save them, I suppose. Hope I never have a chance to find that out. But anyway, you're listening to Wayne Parker and Lang Baker on A Pause for Thought. You feel free to call in 343-9927, 343-9927. We're talking about the sad country of Yemen and the mess it's in today. And so far we've talked about how it was formed and was fought over by various foreign powers, the Romans, Muslims, Ottomans, British, and now, of course, the U.S. and the Saudis and the Iranians are in there too, and we'll get talking more about that. It's somewhere in there, I think it was 1978, where Saleh, I think that's how you say his name.
Yes, when he became president of North Yemen.
Yes.
Who was at that time?
Ali Abdullah Saleh was the president of North Yemen, right, from 1978. And then when the country was when the two countries were unified and became the single Yemen, he also remained
In
the head of
1990, he
yeah.
became president of that country, yeah.
Okay, and he stayed there, and according to what I've read here, he's always been corrupt, weak rule of law. I mean, all this stuff contributed to Al-Qaeda's rise, but also contributed to the Arab uprising in that country, in Yemen. That's kind of what got the ball rolling for the current chapter in their misery.
Right, with the Arab Spring
Mm-hmm.
and the peaceful protests over unemployment and various other problems, as well as Saleh proposing to have his son take over as the president, I believe, was one of the factors mentioned in there. And then after the peaceful protest went on for a while, the police snipers, according to this report, shot down 50 people at one gathering, and then it degenerated from there into chaos. And eventually, Saleh was forced to resign and flee the country to Riyadh and renounce his presidency, and his vice president then became the president. And so you had these two different factions where Saleh was aligning himself with the rebels in the north to attempt to regain power.
The rebels in the north, or Saleh had been in the government, I would have thought he would be. I thought it was the pro-government, the military, that was supporting his side. And I do believe, and I may be wrong, but as I recall, the U.S., when the Arab Spring occurred in Yemen, the U.S. took the side of Saleh and tried to suppress the movement. And that's one of the reasons why it became violent. And then Saleh had to leave, and of course his vice president took over, and by then we'd lost complete control, I guess, is the way I understood it. And his vice president, Mahdi, I think his name was run off as well.
Yeah, I think they both ended up having to flee to Saudi Arabia at one point, and Hadi has, I think he got back into the country, but it's such a chaotic situation.
Yeah, and nobody's doing well from what I've read. Saudi Arabia has been engaging in all kinds of bombings with assistance from the United States, Um, and the Houthis, who are the largest faction, I guess, that is fighting from the south and is trying to take control of the country from the Hadi government, or the Saleh government, they are predominantly Shia Muslim, which is why the Saudi Arabians are against them, because the Saudis prefer Sunni, because I think they're predominantly Sunni Islam in Saudi Arabia. At least the controlling family is. And of course that brings in Iran, because the Islamic Republic of Iran is also Shia. And they're apparently helping the Houthi rebels against the Saudi and American-supported government troops in the northern part of this country. So we have this mess here. But, it's the same old thing. Now, if I think about it, the European powers were there. They began to lose their grip, so we came in. All the while, they've been competing with, first Germany and then the Soviet Union for control of the region, and now Iran is in there tossing in its hand. I'm sure, the Soviet Union, or the Russia now, is involved in it. And it's just a whole bunch of more powerful countries controlling that sad part of the world. And it's creating quite a humanitarian problem, I believe. The Saudis have blockaded the airport at Sana'a, so supplies can't be flown in for the people, and that includes medical supplies and everything else. And also the port at Aden is blockaded, so nothing can get in there. So we're killing those people. And
there's severe malnutrition across the country, destruction of schools. I think I read one report saying that 12,000 out of the 14,400 schools in the country are shut down.
Yeah, and I read, I've got an article here from the Council on Foreign Relations titled Yemen in Crisis, where they talk about 270 health facilities have been either destroyed or severely damaged. Let's see, it says here in 2016, the UN estimated that 2,800 civilians had been killed since the escalation of the war in March. 60% of them were from airstrikes, and of course only the Saudi-led coalition has the capability of engaging in airstrikes. But I would add that the U.S. has been sending in drones and other types of attacks as well that have been hitting civilians in there also. So,
and the U.S. has been supplying air refueling for the Saudi.
And we're selling them the weaponry that they're using, the bombs that they're using also, I believe.
Yeah, and they've identified from cluster bombs that have been recovered that they were manufactured. I believe they identified U.S., British, and Brazilian manufacturers of the cluster bombs.
And I believe it mentions in this CFR report that it's a war crime, considered by the UN a war crime, to sell arms to one side of a conflict like this. So we are, if that's true, we are committing war crimes in Yemen, along with contributing to the murders of a lot of those the civilian population. Are you seeing any of that there? Because I've got some statistics here.
I have read some of that as well. A variety of types of war crimes that, like targeting of civilian areas.
And I guess if our mainstream media had any journalists left, they might report on that sort of thing. But they don't really seem to be pointing out a lot of this. Just like everything else, we don't really hear about it unless we make an effort, and unless we know to go and look at it or look it up and find out. I've got a small piece here from the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, which talks about, it states here that both the Pentagon and the CIA have been operating drones over Yemen, and we hear about that in the news. But they have a chart here labeled Covert U.S. Operations Yemen 2016. And they talk about drone strikes in particular, but they also mention additional U.S. attacks. And by that, they state here that they mean conventional jet aircraft as well as cruise missiles. And it shows here in 2016 there were 32 confirmed drone strikes, there were about 10 to 11 possible drone strikes, and then 6 to 12 additional U.S. attacks. And about 88 to 123 people killed in the drone strikes, the confirmed strikes. 57 to 83 killed in the additional U.S. attacks. And they claim here that 0 civilians and 0 children were reported as killed. And that sounds suspicious to me. Kind of reminds me of the smart bombs we saw the footage of in the first war in Iraq, how they could guide these bombs in and to only kill bad guys and bad guy occupied buildings and stuff. But just that sounds kind of suspicious to see goose eggs all the way across this thing for civilians and children reported killed. But anyway.
Well, I guess that maybe they didn't get any calls at their desks where they received reports.
Yeah, that must have been it. Yeah. Anyway, do you have anything on the starvation? Or
there's that, what you've been describing of the direct casualties and consequences of acts of war, but then there are the side effects of, like the blockade, where there's tremendous malnutrition and food shortages from that affect the civilian population, and the impact on the schools I was referring to, and there's a cholera situation that's, they say that something like 700,000 have been infected with cholera as so far, and I'm seeing some of that in the news today about how it's getting worse and worse from the degradation of safe drinking water and sanitation for the population, where there's tremendous casualties that are not direct from armaments, but they are a consequence of the situation there.
Yes, certainly, and I hadn't thought about that, but you're right. I mean, once you lose your electrical infrastructure and your water systems, there's no way to get rid of sewage, which, as long as people are eating something, is being created. And I know in Iraq that was a very serious problem, and I don't know if they've ever recovered from it, but they had a severe problem with clean drinking water there, and I'm sure they do in Yemen as well. These news stories you've seen, do you know? Do you remember what they were shown on? Do you watch the mainstream media or?
Well, I hear some of this on NPR.
Okay.
And the cholera issue was mentioned in an op-ed in the Los Angeles Times, where this writer in his op-ed is just citing that as one of the problems. But what he's calling attention to is a resolution that's been introduced in the Congress under the War Powers Act of 1973. This was just introduced a few days ago, or late last month, I guess it was, and it calls for the Congress to take action under the War Powers Act, which, if this resolution is passed, will require Congress to either support the involvement in Yemen or direct the President to end the involvement in Yemen. And according to this op-ed, under the War Powers Act, once the concurrent resolution is introduced, the Congress can't stall it in committees. It has after 15 days, it can be forced to be brought to the floor of the Congress, and this was introduced by bipartisan group. 2 Democratic members of Congress and 2 Republican members of Congress have presented this resolution. So it'll be interesting to see whether there's an effort to avoid the procedure that's called for under the War Powers Act and prevent this from coming to a vote.
Okay, now you need to clarify that for me, because you kind of.
Well, under the War Powers Act, a member of Congress can introduce one of these resolutions, and then procedurally that can be forced to be brought to the floor if it hasn't been presented for a vote within 15 days.
Right,
and if that resolution is approved, then Congress either has to vote to authorize the President within 30 days, or the President has to withdraw its participation.
Okay,
US participation in that.
The whole conflict and our involvement with it has been allowed to get to the point where people are dying by the tens of thousands by cholera and starvation or whatever else. And now we're finally maybe going to get something introduced in Congress that will force Congress to either decide to make it an overt approved
Military
action, or get out.
Right.
Sounds like something to be really great for the office pool, I guess, the office betting pool. But anyhow.
Yeah, it says his op-ed says if the House Foreign Affairs Committee does not move the resolution forward within 15 days, it can be brought to the full House for debate and a vote anyway. So that's the way the War Powers Act, the procedure that the War Powers Act provided. And
yes,
these four congressmen have stepped forward to try to force the issue.
Yeah, and it's a shame that it only now is it being addressed by somebody in our Congress, when after all this damage has been done.
Yeah.
But there you go. At least it's being dealt with, and hopefully some responsible media outlet will stay on top of this and keep the American people informed of it. We'll do our best to do it here in Baton Rouge, I suppose, but we can only do so much, really. Anyway, Lang, I guess we're out of time. Again, I got to learn a few new things about Yemen, and I hope everybody listening did. We thank you for listening tonight. You've been listening to Wayne Parker and Lang Baker on A Pause for Thought here on Baton Rouge Community Radio, 96.9 FM in Baton Rouge. We gotta go. You have a good night.